On April 5, 1975, a conference entitled The Central Intelligence Agency and World Peace was held in New Haven, Connecticut, on the campus of Yale University. From one of the afternoon workshops of the conference, Kirkpatrick Sale, author of the book SDS, discusses CIA domestic operations aimed against the political left within the United States. He also explores CIA connections with Yale University and the academic community in general. Kirkpatrick Sale.
I'd like to bring up several parts of the CIA's domestic operations. It seems to me particularly fitting that we should be talking about the CIA and its domestic operations here at Yale University. As you all know, it is the spiritual wellspring for most of the CIA's activities and certainly for its ideology. At least a quarter of the top people of the CIA have come from these distinguished halls. William Buckley, as you know, one of Yale's most notorious graduates. William Sloane Coffin, also in the CIA, who was the chaplain here. Cord Meyer, who is the chief of station now in London and the architect of much of the most evil things that the CIA has done, is a Yale graduate. James Angleton, who recently resigned as head of counterintelligence, a Yale graduate. Dozens of Yale people are in the support groups that the CIA uses. Richard Bissell, of course. Richard Bissell, who was head of, perhaps I shouldn't admit this if you are Yale people yourselves. Richard Bissell was not only a graduate of this university, but he taught here, which trained him to plan and lead the Bay of Pigs operation. I intentionally forgot to mention that, I think. The support groups, the conduits, full of Yale people all over. Frederick Hillis, who was the vice president of the Yale University Press, head of a conduit for the CIA. Morris Hadley, son of a former Yale president whose picture is no doubt among us here, was head of the Rubicon Foundation, another Yale CIA conduit. And then perhaps the foremost example, one Tracy Barnes, who was a high up in the very office of the Domestic Operations Department of the CIA, whose operations we are talking about here today. Tracy Barnes served in that office from roughly 1962 to 1967 when he retired. He retired to Yale University, his old alma mater. And it seemed that he didn't retire all that much either. He became a special assistant to Kingman Brewster in the office of the presidency, specializing in community relations, whatever that may be. But you can be sure that he came out of the heart of the CIA into the heart of academia at the time of growing student turmoil, right through the days of May 1970, when Yale was a focus of some discontent. And during this whole time until 1971, you had a trained spy and counterintelligence agent sitting at the right hand of the president of the university. Now, I don't wish, by mentioning all this, to be uncharitable to this great institution that has let us use their buildings and so on today. But I do think that in the discussion of domestic operations, we ought to be aware that all kinds of institutions have been and are being used by the CIA in the carrying out of its operations. People don't have to be carrying daggers to be spooks. There are three parts of the CIA operation that I want to get to, but I want to make one broad point beforehand, which Frank Donner has touched on, which is that we all ought to know that the CIA has always been mixed up in domestic activity, right from the beginning, and there shouldn't have been any doubt in any of our minds that it was. In just the last week, doing some casual reading in preparation for this conference, I came up with 50 instances which are published or verified in some other way of the CIA operating in a clandestine, secret, underhanded way in the United States. And when one of these things gets exposed, and the New York Times stands up in righteous indignation, we shouldn't think that this just happened, that there are 9,000 files on anti-war people in this country, or that even that the New York Times has just discovered it. This has always been going on. The CIA, after all, if we will think past our civic lessons for just a moment, obviously has to have the entire machinery to operate in this country. It has to recruit people in this country. Once these people are recruited, it has to decide who is not to be recruited, keep a file on them too. Once they're recruited and they are people who are in the agency, they have to check on these people to make sure that they are not running over to the Russians every week. Presumably also to make sure that they're not drunks and homosexuals and whatever else the agency doesn't like. It does keep a watch on foreign officials who are stationed in this country. It does talk to people, Americans, who have been overseas and who come back. And it does keep a filing system for all of these, and not just 9,000, easily 35,000, according to one former officer of the CIA, but plugged into a computer that registers indeed millions. And it does have field offices all over this country, 36 that they own up to. You can pick up the phone book and call them in 36 cities of this country. And who knows what other operations they may have. So it's obvious that they have the machinery here, and it's obvious that they have the interest here in operating domestically. We have known practically since the beginning of the CIA. Stories keep coming out and out and out. In 1954, for example, Congress investigated the CIA's spying on Owen Lattimore, when Owen Lattimore was a target of Senator McCarthy. The CIA was tailing Lattimore around the country, finding out what he was doing. And this became public in 1954. In 1961, we learned all about the Bay of Pigs and the support system that the CIA had built up here in this country, in Louisiana, in Florida, Army CIA training bases practically throughout the South, and use of community people, especially in Florida, for this operation. In 1966, we found out that the CIA was working through Michigan State University and through MIT and other universities in an expose that Ramparts gave us, followed the very next year with an expose of the CIA using the National Student Association. And that, too, triggered stories about how it was using at least 100 separate foundations in this country as conduits for its money. And then Watergate. We saw again at Watergate that the CIA had been used in the Houston Plan, that it was not an accidental addendum to the Houston Plan, which meant all kinds of illegal operations here in this country, but it was a central part of the Houston Plan, and Richard Helms was most cooperative in putting this all together. And you can be sure that little Tom Charles Houston was not the man who put this Houston Plan together. It seems much more likely that some higher-up intelligence source, perhaps Defense Department, or as I like to think, CIA, was really responsible for the organization of the Houston Plan, a plan which we should all remind ourselves was never rescinded and whose operations were in fact carried out in the years after 1970 when it was supposedly disbanded. We learned about CIA doing that during Watergate. We learned how that they had participated in the burglary of Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, in the interrogation of Dita Beard, surveillance for the Miami Convention. And we learned that the CIA, in fact, provided cover and documents, identity documents, for the Watergate burglary itself. all that for 10 years now. We've been hearing about what the CIA has been doing in this country, and people are still shocked and surprised. And the New York Times can still have an editorial of great indignation when we learn that there are 9,000 files kept of anti-war demonstrators and leaders. Of course they had files. It is long past now the time for us to be shocked and surprised that they had files. Of course they had files, and of course they were using them. It is not a matter of shock. The offended innocence, especially of the liberal community, gets under my skin a bit. Anger, outrage, yes, I think that's legitimate. But let us not be innocent and surprised and shocked any longer to discover that these things are going on. They have gone on, they are going on, and they will continue to go on. Now, let me then turn to the three specific areas that I want to talk about, each one fairly briefly. These three areas I pick because it seems to me they document the basic nature of the CIA and its primary function. The first function is the survival function, the sheer task of self-protection, of bureaucratic hegemony, of staying alive, of having a job, of having an agency, in fact. And I take as an example of the carrying out of that function the CIA's participation in the assassination of John Kennedy in 1963. The second function is a repressive function. That is to say, the CIA operates as a political police in part and parcel with the rest of the machinery of state repression. And the example of this that I tend to touch on is the suppression and disruption of the New Left in the 1960s. And the third area, the third function of the CIA is its corporate function, which is to say its enmeshment with the business establishment of this country, particularly the multinational corporations. And the most interesting example of this is the recent story about CIA and the empire of Howard Hughes. So first, to take the survival function of the CIA and the Kennedy assassinations. Now, Mr. Marx does not believe that that there was a official participation by the CIA in this assassination, although it may have been unofficial and various loose operatives may have snuck down to Dallas. My attitude is that it was perfectly consistent for us to believe, although the evidence is by no means all in, to believe that the CIA had in its own self-interest a survival function in Dallas in 1963. There are lots of reasons why it did not like John Kennedy. His entire realm of policies was probably anathema to many of the top CIA people. But I don't think that that is even as crucial as Kennedy's threat to the very survival of the CIA in 1963. Now remember now that there were sweeping changes going on at the CIA in 1963. It had been disgraced by the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and Kennedy had vowed at the time that he would establish much greater control, White House control over the CIA operations. It was being reorganized during the summer of 1963, according to a Kennedy plan which was to have abolished certain bureaus and put other functions elsewhere in the intelligence community. It was brought on the carpet in 1963 by Kennedy when they lied to him about the participation of Frederick Barghorn. If you will recall that, Barghorn, another Yale person, a professor at this university who had gotten picked up by the Russians at a time of very delicate negotiations toward the test ban treaty. And CIA assured Kennedy that Barghorn was innocent. Kennedy assured Khrushchev. They let him go. Barghorn comes into the White House, and Kennedy says, "We're terribly apologetic." He said, "You have nothing to apologize for. I was working for the CIA." And Kennedy was apparently outraged over this deception. At the same time, the CIA's Cuban operations were being curtailed by the Kennedy administration, and at least 4 raids that I know were made by FBI and police upon CIA training areas in Florida and Louisiana during 1963, trying to undercut the CIA's still ongoing interest in Cuba. At the same time, the Southeast Asian operations were being threatened. And to top it all, it was in 1963 that Kennedy said, not long before the trip to Dallas, that he was going to splinter the CIA in 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Now, that was the danger to the agency in November of 1963. In December of 1963, there was no more danger. The withdrawal program that Kennedy had begun in Vietnam was halted. The CIA was permitted to reactivate its bases in Florida and to stage continued raids upon Cuba. In fact, as Mr. Marks has documented in his book, the CIA was then, after this date, allowed to contract with General Dynamics for a special super high-speed hydrofoil boat that could be used between Florida and Cuba for the CIA's mysterious purposes. The black operations of the CIA were expanded in Southeast Asia, in Laos, with continued and greater overflights of China. Chinese claim to have shot down 19 U-2s between 1964 and 1969, and who knows how many others were operating that they did not shoot down. And all of the schemes to reorganize the CIA were also halted in December of 1963. And the CIA head was brought back into the good graces of the new president, Lyndon Johnson, and John McCone was one of the most important people in the first few days in the reorganization of the White House under Johnson. Which is not all of that, which is not to say that the CIA shot John Kennedy, but simply to point out on the old Latin principle of cui bono, to whose advantage. The CIA would seem to have had a lot to benefit from the removal of John Kennedy at that particular time. There are lots of other clues and hints about the CIA's connections in Dallas. Some of them, I trust, will be gone into by experts greater than I this afternoon after our workshops in the auditorium. But I think it helps to think of it in the cui bono framework of who benefited before and afterward from that instance of the CIA at work. Now, the second instance, we are on somewhat firmer grounds. Here, the political function of the CIA, its repressive function as part of the state machinery against the New Left in the 1960s and 70s. The CIA, only one of many groups active in this, and it's hard to isolate who was a CIA agent and who was only an FBI agent and who was drug enforcement and whatnot. Hence, a lot of stories that you hear, people say, I know that so-and-so was a CIA agent, are simply unprovable. And I keep running up against this time and time again. But certain things are obvious. One is that the CIA took an interest in student affairs. We know this. We know this from the NSA. We also know that the CIA no doubt established Young Americans for Freedom. There seems to be no question about that. It's part of its interest to countermand the left. William Buckley, CIA agent, was one of the founders of the YAF. Excuse me. Robert Bennett, a CIA agent, was a founder. Douglas Caddy, a CIA operative, was another founder. And, of course, the fellow who drew up the Houston plan, Charles Houston, was president of YAF. CIA obviously cared about what was going on in the political student world. And hence, we can be sure that what little examples we have of the CIA in action is just the tip of the dagger, the very edge of the cloak of what we know CIA must have been doing. For example, we know that there was a CIA agent in New York City for 4 years operating out of a bureau of more than 25 people, and that it was engaged in wiretapping and bugging, surveillance and photography, disruptions, provocations, and assembling files. He has admitted that he was only one of many agencies operating at the time, but he said with some note of pride that we had the manpower and we had the money. And that's no doubt true. If there is a $750 million budget for the CIA, more or less acknowledged, how much more can the CIA be having, and how much can it then spread around, which the Drug Enforcement Agency and the local Red Squads are not able to do? It had the money, we can be sure. We know that 10 CIA agents infiltrated left groups in Washington, D.C., and that one of them, undercover as a hippie, he says, burned 2 churches in the Washington area. We know that the CIA was used for 40 psychological assessments, as they call them in their shorthand, of anti-war leaders, that it was being used as Hunt used the CIA for a profile of Ellsberg. So at least 40 of these psychological assessments were made on the left at the time. We know that the CIA followed anyone with even faintly leftist credentials who went overseas, that being something that they regarded as their province. And if anyone went to Algeria or Lebanon or Vietnam, or especially Cuba, they were sure to be trailed by the CIA and followed when they got back to see what kind of connections they made here on the home scene. We know also that there were CIA goon squads operating during that time. We know that people paid for and organized by the CIA were used to beat up war protesters in New York City, in Washington, D.C. We know that CIA goon squads, according to the local police, were used to break into and trash movement offices in Los Angeles and in Columbia, South Carolina. And these are the merest outlines of what we know the CIA did. What other agencies did, Mr. Donner has pointed to. But this is what we know about just the CIA. And it seems clear that from these clues, the CIA was operating in this country for at least 7-8 years, and presumably still operating, to try to destroy the left movement in America. It did not, thankfully, succeed in that, but it did accomplish at least part of its goals. The parts of the movement were fragmented. People did grow to distrust each other. Expensive court cases. The openness of the new left was destroyed by the government-created paranoia, and the warmth and affection that had been characteristic of the new left at the beginning became twisted by government-inspired violence and provocateurs. The last example of the CIA at work, its corporate function, is one that we saw through the Howard Hughes caper, but one that we obviously know exists, the coziness between the multinationals who have their far-flung empires that they like to have protected, and the CIA, which is very interested in having cover in all of these far-flung points of empire. The Howard Hughes operation is, to me, particularly interesting because I take it to be an example not simply of the use of the CIA, of business by the CIA, but the takeover of a corporation by the CIA. I believe that the evidence indicates that the Howard Hughes empire has become a corporate entity in service to the CIA, and that the CIA people are operating at the top levels of that empire. You may remember that it was in 1970 at Thanksgiving that the Great Revolution took place in the Howard Hughes empire, and Robert Mayhew was kicked out. Subsequent, and Hughes was sent off to the Bahamas to vegetate. Subsequent to that, a new police force took over all of Howard Hughes's operations at the casinos and elsewhere. A police force called Intertel, made up of intelligence people out of Washington with lots of CIA people all up and down it. Secondly, a new PR lobbying group was used by the Howard Hughes people in Washington, which was the Robert Mullen and Company, which was a CIA cover that began just after this coup in 1970. The Howard Hughes empire went to this CIA cover. One of its vice presidents at the time was that retired CIA man, E. Howard Hunt. A third thing that happened at the same time was that an agreement was signed with the CIA for $250 million to build this submarine operation that would scoop up the Soviet sub off the Pacific floor. At the same time, new officers came into control of the Hughes Aircraft Company, which is now, according to Time, studded with former ranking military and CIA officers, one of whom is A.D. Whelan, who is the new president of Hughes Aircraft Corporation and an ex-CIA man. At the same time, the CIA expanded its office in, of all places, Las Vegas, Nevada, which you would have thought was somewhat far removed from its normal concern about its agents abroad, and you wouldn't have thought there were many Soviet spies there. Yet it is now said to be the second biggest office outside of Langley, Virginia. It is no doubt an unusual move by the CIA to take over a corporation, and I cannot give you a great deal in the way of proof beyond those suggestive items. But think of it for a moment. The CIA, by taking over the Hughes empire, gets a privately held company without public accountability, with built-in machinery and a reputation for secrecy. It gets a gambling network, an enormous gambling network, to launder money and to connect it with the world of organized crime, which it has always been connected with, and makes a very neat interlock through this gambling enterprise. It gets a major defense contractor with which it can keep tabs upon what's going on in military intelligence, and under which it can build any kind of gadgetry it needs to in its operations. It gets a business that is established around the world, and which, according to the Los Angeles police, is already used as a cover to pay agents around the world, CIA agents. It gets a complex of divisions in the Hughes empire. Air West, an airline that wants to go international and may be the successor to the airlines that the CIA has had, whose cover has been blown. And it gets an ocean mining company that it uses to build the submarine operation and so on. In short, the CIA gets a perfect machinery for its operations out of the Hughes empire. And the likelihood that it has done so should not be surprising, since we know of the coziness with the business world and the CIA for some time. Those then I take as the three revealing functions about the CIA: the survival function, the repressive function, and the corporate function. And there may be others, but I think with those three you get a handle on what the CIA is up to and how it operates, and you can fit in anything new that comes along in the headlines into that framework. If we read that the CIA funds the Behavior Institute at UCLA, then that's easy to reconcile with its repressive function. Or that it had a role in Inter-Armco's sale of arms to the Middle East in recent months. Well, Inter-Armco is a CIA operation, and we see there that it's working in its corporate function, sending folks over to protect the fuel lines of the Middle East, has got to be in corporate interests. Now, to understand the CIA in this way, to get a handle on it, I hope you let me make one final point, which is that I'm not meaning to excuse or justify its operations. I should say simply and clearly that there's no question about where I stand. The CIA should be abolished. There seems to be no way that a right-thinking person could believe otherwise. If by chance there are valuable functions that it may perform, I would have to be proven that, but let's say that there is a satellite going around the world that only the CIA can read, and that satellite would tell which countries are going to be starving next year and would prepare us to send food. Perhaps that is a beneficent function that's easily absorbed into the State Department or some other machinery. There is no justification for the offensive and obscene and unnecessary operations of the CIA. Not that it would automatically solve everything if we could abolish the CIA. I wouldn't want you to think that. That would be a great delusion to go away from this conference with. It would not cleanse the American system if there were no more CIA. There would still be dozens of other agencies at work in ways obvious and subtle to diminish our liberties, and we would have to step up our operations to try to identify and to squelch those as well. But it would be a start to work to eliminate the CIA, a start worth working for. And considering the CIA's operations, particularly in the religious and political and educational institutions, I should think that we could say that the elimination of the CIA would strike a blow for God, for country, and for Yale. Thank you.
For more information on the Central Intelligence Agency, contact Center for National Security Studies, 122 Maryland Avenue, Northwest, Washington, D.C., 2002. This program was produced at radio station WWUH in West Hartford, Connecticut.